So let's talk about a cop in a small Minnesota town. For 13 years, the most exciting thing he ever dealt with was probably a Saturday night bar fight. But then came two cases, years apart, that just broke all the rules of logic, and they haunted him for the rest of his life. We're gonna walk through those two chilling and frankly impossible events right through his eyes. Our story kicks off in one of those towns you barely notice on a map, right? The kind of place where nothing is ever supposed to happen. But for this officer, that peaceful illusion was just shattered by a single memory, one that he says even now makes his blood run cold. And it all started about 7 years ago with a woman named Eileen Garrity.
All right, let's rewind to the spring of 2014. The person at the center of all this is Eileen Garrity. She's an elderly widow, lives all by herself in this old, rundown farmhouse. Now, she definitely had a reputation around town, and let's just say people thought she was a little eccentric.
Yeah, Mrs. Garrity was, what you might call a frequent flyer with the local police. She'd call about everything. Bigfoot in her yard, UFOs, you name it. One time, the intruders she heard in her attic turned out to be a bunch of raccoons. The officers on the force, all 5 of them, they knew her well. They'd usually just go out there, calm her down, figuring she was lonely, maybe a little confused.
But this one day, when the officer and his partner rolled up expecting another false alarm, they were just stunned. The woman who met them on the porch was gaunt. She looked like she hadn't eaten in weeks, with these dark, hollowed-out eyes. He said she had that blank, 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who'd seen something truly awful. This was not the Mrs. Garrity they knew.
She told them this story, this month-long descent into absolute terror. It started small, just some soft scratching noises from inside her closet. But then it became a voice, the voice of her dead husband, Bill, begging her to let him out. When she wouldn't, the voice got nasty. Soon after, it wasn't just one closet. It was every closet in the house, being pounded on from the inside, all at the same time. But the final straw was what she saw in the bathroom mirror. This is where her terror just peaked. She said she looked in the mirror, and it wasn't her reflection looking back. It was this hooded figure, a skull with horns and glowing red eyes. And then, she said it reached out of the mirror and tried to grab her.
Now, you're probably thinking this is just a tragic story of a mental breakdown, right? But the thing is, the physical evidence inside her house was, well, it was deeply unsettling. Every single mirror in the place was smashed to pieces. Every closet door was boarded shut with nails. And her husband's old shotgun, it had been fired recently. There was a giant hole blasted right through the hall closet door. Her story sounded crazy for sure, but her fear was very, very real.
So the officers decided she just couldn't stay there. They were convinced she was having a complete breakdown and was a danger to herself. So they drove her into town, got her a room at a little motel. The hope was, a night away from that house might do her some good, and they could arrange for some professional help in the morning. And she seemed so relieved, so grateful to finally be someplace safe.
But that feeling of safety, it didn't last long. At 2 in the morning, the station gets a frantic call from the motel. People in the rooms next to Mrs. Garrity's were reporting these terrifying, just blood-curdling screams. And then suddenly, just silence. When the officers got there, they had to kick the door in because it was chained and locked from the inside. And the scene they walked into was a nightmare. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, all over the bed. The sheets were ripped right off the mattress like she'd been desperately trying to hold on. And then they saw it, 10 thin trails of blood dragged across the carpet.
Those bloody trails, they were from her fingertips. It looked like she'd been dragged from the bed, clawing at the floor the entire way. And those trails led directly to the closet door. The officers opened it, and it was empty. Just empty. Eileen Garrity had vanished from a locked room, with the only clue being a trail of blood leading into a perfectly empty closet.
So for years, the Garrity case was just that, a cold, terrifying, and totally unsolved mystery. The officer tried to file it away. Then, one summer night in 2019, the impossible decided to pay another visit to his little town.
A young woman just appeared in the middle of the police station. The 3 officers on duty that night all swear nobody saw or heard her come in. One second, the room was empty. The next second, she was just there. Soaking wet, pale as a ghost, and her eyes were just wide with panic.
She told them her name was Shirley Ann McDougal, said she was 19 and had lived in that town her whole life. Well,
That was the first massive red flag. You gotta understand, in a town this small, the cops knew pretty much everybody, and not a single one of them had ever seen this girl or even heard the name McDougal before.
And as she started telling them her story about being abducted, things got even weirder. She talked about coming from the Mayan Theater, which had been a liquor store for 30 years. She mentioned getting a soda at Beckman's drugstore, which was now a CVS. The car her kidnapper drove? A couple years old, 1953 Buick. And then, when they asked her who the president was, she said, without skipping a beat, Dwight Eisenhower.
So finally, the police chief just had to lay it all out for her. He calmly told her the date, pointed to a calendar right there on the wall. It wasn't 1956. It was 2019. The world she thought she knew was 63 years in the past.
As you can imagine, this news just completely broke her. She started hyperventilating, said she felt sick, so an officer walked her to the women's restroom. And to make sure she didn't try to bolt, he stood guard directly outside the door, the entire time.
And here is another detail that'll just make your skin crawl. The officer who walked her to the restroom, he said later that his hand accidentally brushed against her arm, and her skin was just unnaturally cold. His exact words were, "It was like touching the skin of a corpse." After a couple minutes of silence, the officers got worried and checked the restroom. It was empty. She was just gone. The only other way out was a tiny little window 10 feet off the ground, and it was locked from the inside. Shirley McDougal had vanished, just as bizarrely as she had arrived.
So now there's another impossible case gone cold. The officers tried to write it off, a prank maybe, or a girl having a breakdown, and they tried to forget it. But then, just last week, a sonar scan in a nearby lake brought a secret that had been buried for 66 years right to the surface.
A fisherman trying out some new high-tech sonar gear spotted a car at the bottom of a lake just outside of town. The police were called, and they managed to pull this rusted-out wreck from the water. And it was clear it had been down there for a very, very long time.
And this timeline is where all the impossible pieces just suddenly click into place. See, in 1956, the real Shirley McDougal disappeared. Then in 2019, someone or something claiming to be her shows up for 20 minutes, and now they finally recovered the last piece of the puzzle. That car was a 1953 Buick. This is where it all comes crashing together. The car wasn't just a 53 Buick. It had Oklahoma plates, just like she'd said. The male skeleton in the driver's seat, identified as a suspected serial killer from the 1950s, known for posing as a priest. And in the trunk, they found another skeleton. Dental records confirmed it. It was Shirley Ann McDougal. Every single impossible detail she told them was absolutely true.
So, after 66 years, the ghost of Shirley McDougal, or whatever it was, got to tell her story. She solved her own murder. But that leaves us with one last terrifying question, doesn't it? If her impossible story turned out to be real, what does that say about the other one? What was the thing with red eyes? And what exactly came for Eileen Garrity when it finally got out of that empty closet?